The summer dust billowed like golden clouds as the stagecoach rattled into Silver Bend, a town where fortunes were made in silver, not gold, where men spoke loudly to be heard over the constant ring of hammers and picks. It was a place that valued noise, the shout of success, the clatter of coins, the boast of achievement. This was no place for silence, no place for someone like Cordelia Palmer. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The stagecoach wheels ground to a halt before the Silver Bend Hotel, a three-story clapboard building that stood like a weathered sentinel at the town's entrance. Cordelia Palmer clutched her small valise tightly, knuckles white against the worn leather. She wore a simple blue dress, high-necked and modest, with not a single ornament to catch the eye. Her honey-brown hair was pulled back in a practical knot, and her eyes, green as spring leaves, stayed fixed on her lap until the last possible moment. When the driver called out Silver Bend Station, she finally looked up, taking a deep breath that did little to calm the fluttering in her chest. The other passengers had already begun to disembark, eager to stretch their legs after the grueling two-day journey from Holliston. Cordelia was the last to rise, smoothing her skirts with trembling hands. "This is it, miss," the driver said, extending a weathered hand to help her down. "Silver Bend, end of the line." She nodded, just nodded, and accepted his help, stepping down into the dust of Main Street. The hustle of Silver Bend immediately assaulted her senses. Miners heading to the saloon, merchants hawking wares, children darting between wagons and horses. It was a symphony of noise that made Cordelia instinctively draw her shoulders inward, making herself smaller. "That must be her," a woman's voice cut through the din. "Awful plain, isn't she? Thought Hayes would have picked someone with more." "A presence," another replied, not bothering to lower her tone. Cordelia pretended not to hear, though her cheeks flushed pink. She'd known there would be whispers, but she hadn't expected them to be so bold, so immediate. She hadn't even met Mr. Hayes yet. At the thought of him, her free hand moved to her pocket, fingering the folded letter that had brought her here. Samuel Hayes, widower, age 37, owner of the Silver Crystal Mine, seeking a respectable wife to help manage his household and provide companionship. The advertisement had been straightforward, practical, just like her reply had been. She scanned the crowded street, searching for a man who might be Samuel Hayes. The letter had said he'd meet her at the station, but no one approached. Minutes ticked by, and the whispers around her grew. She remained, standing, still as stone, beside her single trunk and valise. "Miss Palmer?" The voice came from behind her, deep and impatient. She turned to find a tall man with broad shoulders and a neatly trimmed beard flecked with grey. His suit was expensive but dusty, as if he'd rushed from somewhere important to meet her. "Yes," she said, the word barely audible even to her own ears. Her hand extended automatically in greeting, hanging awkwardly in the air between them. "Samuel." Hayes looked at her hand, then her face, then back to her hand. His expression remained unreadable as he gave it a perfunctory shake. "You're quiet," he stated bluntly. She nodded again, fighting the urge to look away from his piercing gaze. "Your letters were different. More words." His brow furrowed. "Can you speak? Properly, I mean." "Yes," Cordelia said, forcing herself to project her voice. "I can speak, Mr. Hayes. I simply prefer not to when it isn't necessary." His frown deepened. "Everything here requires communication, Miss Palmer. A mining town's no place for silence." He looked her up and down again, evidently finding her lacking. "The wagon's this way." He turned without waiting for a response, signaling a young boy to handle her trunk. Cordelia followed, her steps measured and deliberate, ignoring the stares that tracked her progress down the street. The wagon ride to Hayes Manor was uncomfortable in every sense. The rough-hewn bench offered little cushioning against the rutted, road. But the silence between them was even harder. Twice Samuel Hayes began to speak, only to fall quiet when Cordelia's responses came soft and brief. The questions he asked required simple answers, and simple answers were what she gave. "Why'd you answer my advertisement?" he finally asked, as they passed the last buildings of Silver Bend proper. Cordelia watched the sprawling landscape unfold before them, pine forests climbing rocky hills, a silver ribbon of river cutting through the valley below. "I needed somewhere to go," she answered honestly. "My father passed away last winter. The school where I taught closed. Your letter offered purpose. You were a teacher." Something like hope flickered across his face. "Yes, for young children. 5 years. Then you can't be too quiet in a classroom full of little ones." "Children don't judge silence the way adults do," she replied, her voice gaining a hint of warmth for the first time. "They understand when words aren't needed." The hope in his expression dimmed. "Well, we're not dealing with children here, Miss Palmer. Silver Bend needs a woman who can hold her own. Speak up at gatherings, charm investors. The silver crystal mine is expanding, and I need a wife who can be the face of our social obligations." Cordelia's hands tightened in her lap. "Your letter mentioned companionship and household management, not social performance." Hayes exhaled sharply through his nose. "Perhaps I wasn't clear enough, or perhaps you weren't listening closely enough." They crested a hill, and Hayes Manor came into view, a grand 2-story house built of stone and timber, with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. It should have been impressive, welcoming even, but to Cordelia it suddenly seemed like a prison, a place where she would constantly fall short of expectations. "It's not too late, you know," Hayes said, slowing the horses. "The stage returns east tomorrow morning. I can arrange your passage." Cordelia stared at the house, then at the vast, unknown wilderness surrounding it. 500 miles from anywhere she'd ever called home, with barely enough money for a week's lodging, let alone a return ticket. "You're sending me away because I'm quiet?" "I'm being practical, Miss Palmer. I need a wife who can command a room. Someone people will listen to, someone who speaks with authority when I'm down in the mines. You're—" He gestured vaguely at her hardly more than a whisper. "Silver Bend would eat you alive." The wagon rolled to a stop before the house. A middle-aged woman emerged onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, curiosity evident in her stance. "That's Mrs. Winters, my housekeeper," Hayes explained. "She'll fix us dinner and you can stay the night. I'll have you back to town in the morning." Cordelia didn't move. "You haven't even given me a chance." "I don't need to waste time on what I already know won't work." His voice wasn't cruel, just matter of fact. "Better to send you home now than let you suffer here." "I have no home to return to, Mr. Hayes," he sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Then I'll advance you enough for lodging in town until you find something else. I'm not heartless, Miss Palmer, just practical." The word struck her like a physical blow. Practical. It was what she had always prided herself on being. Practical, sensible Cordelia, who never caused trouble, never raised. Her voice never demanded attention. And now, her practicality, her very nature, had become her undoing. She stepped down from the wagon without assistance, straightening her spine and lifting her chin. She would not cry. Not here. Not in front of this man who had judged her so quickly. "So finally, Mrs. Winters," Hayes called out, "we have a guest for dinner and the night. Miss Palmer will be returning to town tomorrow." The housekeeper's face registered surprise, then understanding, then pity. Cordelia felt each emotion like a lash against her dignity. "You never mentioned in your letters that you required a performer." "Mr. Hayes," Cordelia said, her voice still quiet but sharp with newfound resolve. "Perhaps you should specify that in your next advertisement. Save the next woman on the journey." For the first time, Samuel Hayes looked genuinely discomforted. He cleared his throat, adjusted his collar, and finally nodded. "Perhaps I should. Now, Shall we go inside? It's been a long day for both of us. As she followed him up the steps, to a house that would never be hers, Cordelia felt something shift within her. She had come west seeking purpose, stability, a place to belong. Instead, she had found rejection before she'd even had a chance to prove herself. Tomorrow, she will be back in Silver Bend, alone, without prospects or connections. Because in a town that valued noise above all else, her quiet nature was considered a fatal flaw. But Silver Bend was about to learn that silence had a power all its own. Dawn broke over Silver Bend in shades of amber and gold, light spilling across the town's uneven rooftops like molten metal. Cordelia stood on the hotel porch watching as the town slowly awakened. A night of restless sleep had left dark shadows beneath her eyes, but her resolve had only strengthened with the rising sun. Samuel Hayes had been true to his word. He'd delivered her to the Silver Nugget Hotel with enough money for 2 weeks' lodging and a terse apology. Then he'd vanished back to his grand house on the hill, leaving Cordelia to contemplate her future. In a town that already seemed to have decided she didn't belong, the hotel proprietress, Mrs. Abigail Quinn, was a sharp-eyed woman with iron-grey hair and hands rough from decades of work. She'd looked Cordelia up and down with an assessing gaze the previous evening, noting her simple dress and single trunk. "Another bride that didn't take?" she'd asked bluntly. "Hayes ain't the first to send 'em back, won't be the last either." Now, watching the street come to life, Cordelia knew she had precisely 14 days to find a purpose in Silver Bend, or face the prospect of becoming truly destitute in a town where she knew no one. She clutched a small notebook in her hands. "ISU, a list of possibilities already written in her neat, precise handwriting." The school was her first choice. Her experience as a teacher might serve her well there. If not, perhaps one of the shops needed assistance, or a family required a governess. Silver Bend was growing. Surely there was a place for someone willing to work hard, even if she wasn't one for idle chatter. Taking a deep breath, Cordelia stepped off the porch and into the dusty street, ignoring the curious glances from passers-by who had witnessed her arrival the previous day. The whispers followed her like shadows. "That's her, the mail-order bride Hayes sent packing. Didn't even last a day at the manor. Never say a word, that one. Strange as can be." Cordelia kept her eyes forward, spine straight, steps measured and deliberate. Let them talk. She had more important matters to attend to. The Silver Bend schoolhouse sat at the edge of town, a simple wooden building with a small bell tower and windows that gleamed in the morning light. Children's laughter spilled from the open door as Cordelia approached, a sound that momentarily lifted her spirits. This, at least, was familiar territory. Inside, chaos reigned. Nearly 30 children of various ages were scattered throughout the room, some engaged in lessons, others chasing each other between desks, while a harried-looking young woman attempted to restore order. Arithmetic books opened to page 27. "Thomas Jackson, put down that frog this instant. Sarah, stop pulling Madeline's braids." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The woman, clearly the teacher, was barely older than Cordelia herself, with flushed cheeks and desperation in her eyes. She glanced up as Cordelia entered, relief washing over her face at the sight of another adult. "Oh, thank heavens. Are you the school board representative? I've been begging for an assistant for months." Cordelia shook her head, but before she could speak, the teacher was already continuing, words tumbling out in a breathless rush. "I'm Rebecca Holloway. I have 32 students across 6 grades, and the school board expects me to manage them, all while preparing them for examinations and teaching them proper deportment. It's impossible, simply impossible." A paper airplane sailed across the room, narrowly missing Rebecca's head. "Joshua Andrews, that will be enough." Cordelia surveyed the chaos, noting the mixture of boredom and mischief on the children's faces. Without thinking, she moved to the teacher's desk at the front of the room, picked up a small handbell and rang it 3 times. Clear, musical tones that cut through the noise. The unexpected sound captured the children's attention. 32. Pairs of eyes turned toward her, curious about this stranger who had appeared in their classroom. Cordelia set down the bell and lifted her hands, moving them in a deliberate pattern. First, she touched her fingers to her lips, then moved both hands downward in a calming gesture. Next, she pointed to her eyes, then to her ears, and finally folded her hands peacefully before her. The children started, transfixed by the silent communication. One by one they quieted, returning to their seats with only occasional whispers. "How did you do that?" Rebecca whispered, astonished. "Hand signs," Cordelia replied softly. "I taught several deaf children back east. Sometimes the most effective. Communication doesn't require words at all." Rebecca gaped at her, then at the now attentive classroom. Are you looking for employment, Miss Palmer?" Cordelia Palmer. "And yes, I am." "Well, Miss Palmer, I don't care if you never speak another word as long as you live. If you can keep these children in line, I'll hire you on the spot." She lowered her voice further. "The pay isn't much, mind you, but there's a small room at the back of the schoolhouse where the previous teacher lived. It's yours if you want it." For the first time since arriving in Silver Bend, Cordelia felt a genuine smile touch her lips. "I accept." The morning passed in a blur of activity as Cordelia settled into her new role. Rebecca assigned her the younger children, those in their first and second years of schooling, while she focused on the older students. Cordelia's group sat in a semicircle at the back of the room, their small faces upturned and attentive as she taught them their letters and numbers, her voice gentle but clear. When words failed to capture their attention, she used her hands again, turning the alphabet into a game of shapes and movements that had the children giggling and mimicking her gestures. By midday, they were calling her Miss Cordelia and competing to sit closest to her during lessons. "You're a natural with them," Rebecca commented during the lunch hour as the children played in the schoolyard under the watchful eyes of 2 older students. "Where did you learn those hand signs?" Cordelia hesitated, unused to sharing personal details, but Rebecca's interest seemed genuine, without the judgment she'd faced from others. "My younger sister was born deaf," she explained. "Our parents didn't know how to communicate with her, so I created signs for us. Later, I learned there were official methods, American Sign Language. I studied it whenever I could find books, or meet others who knew it. And you taught deaf children in a regular school?" "Not exactly. I taught at a small school in Massachusetts, but I took on deaf students privately. No one else would teach them." A shadow crossed her face. "People assumed their silence meant they had nothing to say." Rebecca studied her thoughtfully. "People can be quick to judge what they don't understand." "Yes," Cordelia agreed quietly, thinking of Samuel Hayes and his immediate dismissal. "They certainly can." By the time school ended that afternoon, Cordelia's voice was hoarse from more use than it had seen in months, but her heart was lighter. As the last student departed, Rebecca showed her to the small room behind the schoolhouse, a modest space with a narrow bed, a washstand, a bookshelf, and a small desk beneath a window that overlooked a meadow. "It's not much," Rebecca apologized, "but it's private. The school board covers the cost of firewood in winter, and there's a pump out back for water." "It's perfect," Cordelia assured her, already envisioning how she would arrange her few belongings in this space that was now hers. After Rebecca left for her own home in town, Cordelia returned to the hotel to collect her trunk. Mrs. Quinn seemed surprised by the news of her employment. "The schoolhouse? Well, I'll be. Didn't think they needed help." She gave Cordelia a shrewd look. "Though I suppose if anyone could get those wild hellions to behave, it'd be someone who can speak without battling the noise they make." Cordelia offered a small smile, but didn't respond to the backhanded compliment. She paid for her single night's stay, then requested a wagon to transport her trunk to the schoolhouse. "There's Fletcher's delivery service down the street," Mrs. Quinn suggested, "though he charges a pretty penny even for short trips." "Is there perhaps another option?" Cordelia asked, conscious of her limited funds. Mrs. Quinn hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Well, there's Wilson's place at the edge of town. He runs the blacksmith shop. Might haul your trunk for the price of a hot meal. He's different, though, keeps to himself, deaf as a post." Cordelia's head snapped up. "A deaf blacksmith? Strange, ain't it? How a man who can't hear works with metal all day. But he does. Good work, I'll give him that, just don't expect conversation." For the first time since arriving in Silver Bend, Cordelia felt a flutter of genuine interest. "Where can I find this Mr. Wilson?" Following Mrs. Quinn's directions, Cordelia made her way to the far edge of town, where the buildings thinned and the wilderness encroached. The rhythmic clang of hammer on metal guided her to a large wooden structure with an open front, smoke billowing from its stone chimney. As she approached, she could make out a broad-shouldered figure inside, silhouetted against the forge's glow. A man stood with his back to her, one arm raising and lowering a hammer in a hypnotic rhythm, each strike sending sparks dancing into the air. He wore no shirt in the forge's heat, only canvas trousers and a leather apron, his skin gleaming with sweat. The man continued his work, unaware of her presence. Taking a deep breath, Cordelia stepped fully into the workshop, moving carefully into his line of sight while staying well away from the hot forge. The blacksmith looked up, his hammer pausing mid-strike. His eyes, a startling shade of blue, widened slightly at the sight of her, then narrowed in question. He set down his hammer and straightened, his expression guarded but not unwelcoming. Nathaniel Wilson was not what Cordelia had expected. His face was younger than she'd imagined, perhaps 30, with strong features softened by expressive eyes. A scar ran along his jawline, disappearing into a short, neatly trimmed beard. His dark hair was tied back from his face, revealing ears that bore the mottled marks of old burns. Gathering her courage, Cordelia raised her hands and signed, "Hello, my name is Cordelia Palmer." The shock on his face was immediate, his work roughened. Hands freezing in place as he registered what she was doing. For a moment, he simply stared. Then, slowly, his hands lifted in response. You know the sign. His movements were different from what she was accustomed to, rougher, more direct, adapted to hands that worked metal rather than delicate things. Cordelia nodded, a smile touching her lips. "Yes, I learned it for my sister. She was deaf." Was he signed? Catching the past tense immediately. "She died 5 years ago. Fever." His expression softened with understanding. "I'm sorry." Then, with a hint of suspicion, "Why are you in Silver Bend?" It was a question too complex for her limited signing skills, especially given the differences in their styles. Cordelia reached into her pocket and withdrew a small slate and chalk that she'd carried since her teaching days. "May I?" she asked aloud, gesturing to the slate, knowing he would see the question in her face, if not hear it in her voice. He nodded, wiping his hands on a nearby rag, before accepting the slate. Cordelia wrote quickly, "I came as a mail-order bride for Samuel Hayes, but he rejected me for being too quiet. I'm now the assistant teacher at the school. I need help moving my trunk from the hotel to the schoolhouse." Nathaniel read the message, his eyebrows rising slightly at the mention of Hayes. He took the chalk from her fingers, his touch careful despite his calloused hands, and wrote beneath her words, "Hayes is a fool who loves his own voice too much. I will help you." When? Cordelia felt something warm unfurl in her chest, relief perhaps, or recognition. For the first time since arriving in Silver Bend, she had found someone who understood the value of silence. Now, she signed hopefully. Nathaniel glanced at his unfinished work, then back at her. A small smile lifted one corner of his mouth as he nodded. Now, he agreed, reaching for his shirt. As he doused the forge, Cordelia realized that in a town that prized noise and spectacle, she had found unexpected kinship with a man who lived in perpetual silence. They were both outsiders, both misunderstood, and perhaps both stronger than Silver Bend gave them credit for. The wagon jolted over the rutted path leading to the schoolhouse, each bump sending vibrations through the wooden bench where Cordelia sat beside Nathaniel. Her trunk was secured in the back with rope, its weathered leather a testament to her journey from east to west. Nathaniel handled the reins with practiced ease, his attention divided between the road and Cordelia's hands as she signed simple questions about Silver Bend. Their conversation was unhurried, punctuated by pauses when signing became too complex and they resorted to the slate. These silences felt comfortable, natural, unlike the strained quiet that had stretched between her and Samuel Hayes. "How long have you lived in Silver Bend?" Cordelia signed. Nathaniel thought for a moment, his brow furrowing in calculation. 8 years, he finally responded, his hands moving decisively. "Came after the war." Cordelia nodded, recognizing the shadow that crossed his face at the mention of the conflict that had torn the nation apart. Many men carried such shadows, though few spoke of them. "Were you born deaf?" she asked, then immediately worried the question might be too personal. But Nathaniel didn't seem offended. He shook his head. "Cannon fire," he signed, gesturing to his scarred ears. "Battle of Chickamauga." Realization dawned on Cordelia. The war had taken his hearing, just as illness had taken her sister's. Both losses had shaped their lives in profound ways, steering them toward this unexpected meeting in a frontier town. As they approached the schoolhouse, Rebecca Holloway emerged onto the small porch, her expression shifting from welcome to surprise at the sight of Nathaniel. "Mr. Wilson," she greeted him, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty. "This is unexpected." Nathaniel nodded politely, but didn't attempt to speak. Instead, he moved to the back of the wagon and began untying Cordelia's trunk. "You know Mr. Wilson?" Rebecca asked Cordelia quietly. "We just met," Cordelia explained. "Mrs. Quinn at the hotel suggested he might help with my trunk. I didn't realize—" She hesitated, unsure how to explain the immediate connection she'd felt with the deaf blacksmith. "It's just, he rarely interacts with folks in town," Rebecca whispered. "Keeps to himself. Some people find him intimidating." Cordelia glanced at Nathaniel, who was now lifting her trunk with impressive strength, seemingly oblivious to their conversation. There was nothing intimidating about him to her eyes, only a quiet dignity and careful precision in his movements. "He's been very kind," she said simply. With the trunk unloaded and carried inside to Cordelia's small room, an awkward moment followed. Rebecca excused herself to prepare lesson plans, leaving Cordelia and Nathaniel standing in the doorway of the schoolhouse. Cordelia reached for the small purse at her waist, but Nathaniel shook his head firmly when she offered payment. "No," he signed, "no charge. Then let me thank you properly," she responded. "Dinner? I can cook." Something like surprise, then pleasure, flickered across his face. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded. "Tomorrow," he suggested. "I have work to finish today." They agreed on a time, and as Nathaniel climbed back into his wagon, Cordelia felt a strange reluctance to see him go. He had been in her life for barely an hour, yet already he represented something vital, understanding without judgment, communication beyond words. She watched until his wagon disappeared around the bend, then turned to arrange her small room. Her mind already planning tomorrow's meal, news traveled quickly in Silver Bend. By the following morning, whispers about the quiet new schoolteacher and her interaction with the deaf blacksmith had spread through town. Children arrived at school full of questions. Is it true you talk with your hands, Miss Cordelia? My ma says you're sweet on that scary blacksmith. Can you teach us to do hand talking too? Cordelia addressed their curiosity with calm directness, explaining in simple terms about sign language and how it helped people communicate when words couldn't be heard. It's another way of speaking, she told them, like how you might wave hello instead of saying it. Your hands can tell whole stories if you learn how. The children were fascinated, especially when she showed them the signs for their names. By lunchtime, they were practicing simple greetings with one another, giggling at their clumsy attempts. Rebecca observed these lessons with growing interest. "You're opening a whole new world for them," she commented during a quiet moment. "I've lived in Silver Bend all my life, and I never considered how someone like Mr. Wilson experiences it." "Most people don't," Cordelia replied, her voice tinged with an old sadness. "It's easier to avoid what we don't understand than to learn new ways of connecting." As the afternoon sun began its descent, Cordelia prepared for Nathaniel's visit. She had purchased simple ingredients from the general store: flour, butter, dried beans, salt pork, and apples for a modest pie. It wasn't much, but she took pride in creating something welcoming from her limited resources. The small stove in the schoolhouse kitchen glowed with warmth as she worked, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. Cooking had always been a solace, and for her, a creative act that required no words, only attention and care. Precisely at the agreed time, a knock sounded at the schoolhouse door. Cordelia wiped her hands on her apron and went to answer it, finding Nathaniel standing on the porch. He had changed from his work clothes into a clean white shirt and dark trousers, his hair neatly combed and tied back. In his hands, he held a small wooden box. "You look nice," she signed, then blushed at her forwardness. He smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his serious face, and handed her the box. Inside was a delicately crafted iron bookmark, its edge curved into an intricate leaf pattern. "I made this," he signed, "for your books." Cordelia ran her finger along the smooth metal, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "It's beautiful. Thank you." She invited him inside, where the schoolroom had been transformed by the golden light of oil lamps and the rich aromas of her cooking. She had set the teacher's desk as a dining table, covering its scarred surface with a clean cloth and arranging her few pieces of tableware as elegantly as she could manage. The meal was simple: bean soup with salt pork, cornbread and apple pie, but Nathaniel ate with evident appreciation. They conversed through a mixture of signs, written notes and expressive glances, developing a rhythm that felt increasingly natural as the evening progressed. Through their fractured, imperfect communication, Cordelia learned Nathaniel's story bit by bit. He had been a farmer's son from Ohio, taught blacksmithing by his father before the war called him away. After losing his hearing, he had wandered west, seeking a place where a man could be judged by his work rather than his words. Silver Bend had offered that opportunity, even if it hadn't offered friendship or understanding. "People here think I'm slow-witted because I don't speak," he wrote on the slate. "Easier to let them think that than try to explain." "I understand," Cordelia responded. "When you're quiet, people fill the silence with their own assumptions." He nodded, a look of profound recognition in his eyes. "Why did Hayes reject you?" he asked. Suddenly. "Really?" Cordelia considered the question, formulating her answer carefully before writing. "He wanted a woman who could charm investors and command social gatherings, someone whose voice would echo his importance." "I'm not that woman." Nathaniel's expression darkened. He took the chalk, his strokes firm against the slate. His loss. The simple sentiment warmed her more than it should have. As the evening drew to a close, Nathaniel helped Cordelia clear the dishes. Their hands brushed occasionally, each touch sending A peculiar awareness through her. It had been so long since anyone had truly seen her, not as a quiet woman to be fixed or changed, but as a person whose silence held strength. At the doorway, they paused. Nathaniel's blue eyes studied her face in the lamplight, his expression serious once more. "Thank you," he signed. "Best meal in years." "Thank you for helping me," she responded, "and for understanding." He hesitated, then added, "I work at the forge every day. If you need anything." The invitation lingered between them, unfinished but clear. Cordelia nodded, smiling. "Good night, Nathaniel." "Good night, Cordelia." She watched him walk away, his broad figure gradually dissolving into the darkness. Only after he had disappeared did she realize it was the first time he had signed her name, his, fingers shaping the letters with a care that made it feel like more than just a name. It felt like recognition. The days that followed established a new pattern in Cordelia's life. Mornings and afternoons were devoted to the school children, who were rapidly progressing in both their studies and their enthusiasm for sign language. Evenings were her own, split between lesson preparation and increasingly frequent visits to Nathaniel's forge. At first, she brought practical excuses: a broken hinge from the schoolhouse door, questions about heating the classroom stove more efficiently. But soon they abandoned pretense. She would arrive with a basket of fresh bread or preserved fruit, and they would sit outside the forge as dusk settled, conversing in their unique blend of sign and written word. These quiet meetings did not go unnoticed in Silver Bend. Whispers followed Cordelia through town, some amused, some disapproving, some simply curious about the unexpected friendship between the silent schoolteacher and the deaf blacksmith. "Birds of a feather," Mrs. Quinn remarked to a customer at the hotel. "Both odd but harmless enough." Others were less charitable. Samuel Hayes, when he came to town for supplies, observed Cordelia signing with Nathaniel outside the general store, and frowned deeply, as if personally offended by their evident rapport. "Strange company you're keeping, Miss Palmer," he commented as he passed, speaking loudly as if she, too, might be deaf. Cordelia merely nodded politely and continued her conversation with Nathaniel, who had noticed Hayes but gave no indication of concern. "He still watches you," Nathaniel signed later as they walked toward the schoolhouse. "I'm curious," Cordelia responded. "The mail-order bride who failed before she began." Nathaniel's expression grew serious. "You didn't fail." He did. The statement, so simple and direct, touched something deep within her. For the first time since arriving in Silver Bend, Cordelia felt truly seen, not as a disappointment or an oddity, but as a woman of value exactly as she was. As autumn painted the hills, around Silver Bend in gold and crimson, Cordelia's place in the community gradually shifted. Parents noted their children's progress under her guidance, particularly the previously troublesome ones who responded to her quiet, firm approach. Several mothers sought her advice on managing spirited youngsters, while others brought mending or baking in exchange for simple sign language lessons. Even Rebecca, initially puzzled by Cordelia's methods, had become an advocate. "I've never seen the children so engaged," she admitted one afternoon. "Especially little Thomas Jackson. He used to be our biggest troublemaker, but now he's helping the younger ones with their signs." Thomas, a freckle-faced boy of 9 with perpetually scraped knees, had indeed become Cordelia's most enthusiastic pupil. His nimble fingers quickly mastered the basic signs, and his natural empathy made him eager to help others learn. "My pa says Mr. Wilson ain't really as smart as other folks," Thomas confided to Cordelia one day after school. "But that's not true, is it? He just talks differently." "Your father is mistaken," Cordelia replied gently. "Mr. Wilson is very intelligent. Sometimes people confuse speaking with thinking, but they're not the same thing at all." Thomas considered. "This with a child's directness, like how you're real quiet but you know lots of things?" Cordelia smiled. Exactly like that. The boy nodded decisively. I'm gonna tell Pa he's wrong then. Perhaps, Cordelia suggested, you could show your father some signs instead. Sometimes showing works better than telling. This exchange proved prophetic. Within days, several children had begun teaching simple signs to their parents, creating small ripples of change throughout Silver Bend. Most adults participated with amused tolerance, viewing it as a harmless game. But a few, like Thomas's father, a burly miner with a surprisingly gentle touch when forming signs with his rough hands, embraced the learning with genuine interest. On a crisp Saturday morning in late October, Cordelia visited Nathaniel's forge. With news of this development, he was working on a complex piece when she arrived, a decorative gate commissioned by one of the wealthier mine owners. His concentration was absolute, his powerful arms guiding the hammer with precision as he shaped the hot metal. Cordelia waited patiently, admiring the fluid strength of his movements. There was a kind of poetry in his work, a language of iron and fire that spoke through his hands as clearly as any words could have. When he finally looked up and noticed her, his face brightened. He set down his hammer and wiped his hands before signing. "Good morning. You're early. I couldn't wait to tell you," she signed back, her movements animated with excitement. "The children are teaching their parents to sign. Thomas Jackson's father asked me how to sign 'good work' so he could use it at the mine." Nathaniel stared at her, his expression shifting from surprise to something deeper, more complex. People in Silver Bend, learning to sign. His hands moved with skepticism. "Just simple things," Cordelia clarified. "But it's a beginning." He shook his head slowly, not in negation, but in wonder. "You've been here less than 2 months. We've been here," she corrected, emphasizing the sign for "we" with deliberate care. Something shifted in his gaze then, a vulnerability that made Cordelia's heart quicken. For a moment, neither moved. Then, Nathaniel reached for the slate that now permanently resided on his workbench. "I never thought I would belong in Silver Bend," he wrote. "Then you arrived." The simple statement hung between them, honest and unadorned as the metal he worked. Cordelia took the chalk, her hand slightly unsteady. "I came looking for a place to belong. I think I've found it." Their eyes met over the written words, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Nathaniel's hand moved toward hers, his fingers rough with calluses but achingly gentle as they covered her smaller ones. The moment was broken by the sudden arrival of Thomas Jackson, who burst into the forge with childish exuberance. "Miss Cordelia, Mr. Wilson, you gotta come quick," he exclaimed, then remembered to sign along with his words, his small hands moving rapidly, if imperfectly. "There's trouble at the saloon. Mr. Hayes is really mad, saying awful things about both of you." Cordelia's stomach clenched. "What things, Thomas?" The boy shifted uncomfortably. "Mean things. About you two being wrong somehow. And about the school teaching devil's talk with hands." His distress was evident. "Pa told him to shut his mouth. But Mr. Hayes has been drinking, and he's got those mean fellows with him, the ones who work his mine." Nathaniel, who had been watching Thomas's signs and Cordelia's lips, frowned deeply. He picked up the slate. "What's happening?" Cordelia quickly explained, her handwriting less neat than usual. Nathaniel's expression hardened as he read. "Stay here," he signed firmly. "I'll handle it." "No," Cordelia said aloud, remembering to sign simultaneously. "We'll handle it together." Nathaniel looked ready to argue, but something in her face must have dissuaded him. After a moment he nodded, reaching for his shirt. Thomas watched this exchange with wide eyes. "Are you gonna fight Mr. Hayes?" he asked, a hint of excitement creeping into his voice. "No, Thomas," Cordelia assured him. We're going to talk to him." She paused, then added more quietly, "In whatever language he understands." As they walked toward town, Nathaniel beside her and Thomas trailing slightly behind, Cordelia felt an odd calm settle over her. The woman who had stepped off the stagecoach barely 2 months ago, uncertain, anxious, desperate for approval, seemed like a stranger now. Silver Bend had rejected her for her quietness. Now it would learn just how powerful silence could be. The Silver Dollar Saloon dominated the center of Main Street, its swinging doors spilling light and noise into the gathering dusk. Even from a distance, Cordelia could hear raised voices, Samuel Hayes's distinctive tenor cutting through the general din. Outside the saloon, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by the commotion within. Thomas's father, Jacob Jackson, broke away from the onlookers when he spotted them approaching. "Miss Palmer," he greeted her with a respectful nod. "Mr. Wilson." He turned to his son with a stern expression. "Thomas, I told you to stay put." "Had to warn them, Pa," Thomas replied stubbornly. Jacob sighed, then addressed Cordelia. "Hayes has been drinking since noon. Started spouting nonsense about an hour ago, saying you're filling the children's heads with devil talk and turning the town against decent folk." He glanced at Nathaniel. "Said some other things not fit for repetition." Cordelia nodded quickly, signing a translation for Nathaniel, whose jaw tightened visibly. "How many men are with him?" she asked. 4 or 5 of his mine supervisors, all half-drunk and looking for trouble. Jacob's expression was troubled. "Sheriff's out at the Reynolds farm, handling a dispute. Won't be back till morning." Nathaniel tapped Cordelia's shoulder and signed, "You should go back to the school." "Not safe." "We stayed together," she replied firmly. He studied her face for a moment, then nodded, his expression a mixture of concern and something that looked remarkably like pride. As they approached the saloon, the doors burst open and Samuel Hayes emerged, flanked by 2 burly men. His face was flushed with alcohol, his normally immaculate appearance disheveled. He stopped short at the sight of Cordelia and Nathaniel, a sneer distorting his features. "Well, if it isn't the mute and the deaf," he called, his voice carrying down the street. "Come to see what real people sound like?" Several bystanders shifted uncomfortably, but no one intervened. Hayes took their silence as encouragement. "Warned you, didn't I?" he continued, addressing Cordelia directly now. "Said this town would eat you alive. Instead, you've been filling our children's heads with your strange gestures, making them think there's something wrong with speaking God's good English." Cordelia felt Nathaniel tense beside her, but she placed a subtle hand on his arm before stepping forward. She kept her voice level, but loud enough to carry to the gathered crowd. "The children are learning more than one way to communicate, Mr. Hayes. That's all." She maintained eye contact, refusing to be intimidated. "Knowledge is never a curse," Hayes snorted. "Knowledge, is that what you call it? Looks like witchcraft to me, talking with hands like some kind of savage." He swayed slightly, pointing an accusing finger. "And you've bewitched half the town with your quiet ways, haven't you? Even turned children against their parents." "That's not true, Mr. Hayes," Thomas piped up unexpectedly from behind Cordelia. "I still listen to my pa. I just know more things now." Hayes's gaze swiveled to the boy, then to Jacob Jackson, who had moved protectively closer to his son. "You letting a woman and a deaf mute tell you how to raise your boy, Jackson?" Jacob straightened, his miner's shoulders squared. "I let my boy learn useful things, Hayes, and respect for others is the most useful thing there is." A murmur of agreement rose from several onlookers. Hayes's face darkened as he realized he was losing his audience. "She wasn't good enough to be my wife," he spat, gesturing wildly at Cordelia. "Not good enough for a real man. So she settled for damaged goods." His contemptuous gaze flicked to Nathaniel. "Can't even defend yourself, can you, Wilson? Need a woman to speak for you?" Nathaniel's expression remained impassive, but Cordelia could see the tension in every line of his body. She began to sign, translating Hayes's words. Nathaniel caught, her hands stopping her with a subtle shake of his head. He already understood the gist from Hayes's sneering expression and Cordelia's reaction. To everyone's surprise, Nathaniel stepped forward. He pointed at Hayes, then at himself, then made a gesture of writing in the air. Hayes's sneer deepened. "What's he doing? Some kind of threat?" "He's challenging you," Cordelia translated, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. "But not to a fight, to a contest of skill." This interpretation caused a ripple of interest among the spectators. Nathaniel nodded, then elaborated with signs that Cordelia translated for the crowd. "He says you claim to be better than him because you can hear and speak. He challenges you to prove your superiority through actions, not words." Hayes blinked, momentarily thrown off balance by this unexpected turn. "What kind of contest?" Nathaniel looked to Cordelia, who understood immediately. "The fall festival is in 2 weeks. Mr. Wilson proposes that you each create something of value for the auction. You with all your advantages, he with his supposed disadvantages. Let the town decide whose work is worth more." Hayes scoffed. "He's a blacksmith. I'm a mine owner. It's hardly a fair comparison." "Then it should be easy for you to win," Cordelia replied coolly. "Unless your confidence is only in your voice, not your abilities." The challenge hung in the air, impossible for Hayes to dismiss without losing face before the very townspeople whose respect he craved. Several of the miners exchanged glances, clearly interested in seeing their boss put to such a test. "Fine," Hayes finally spat. "Let him try to beat me. It'll only prove what everyone already knows, that a man who can't even hear isn't worth half a normal man." Nathaniel's expression didn't change, but he extended his hand formally. After a moment's hesitation, Hayes grasped it briefly, then turned away, motioning for his companions to follow. "This isn't over," he muttered as he passed Cordelia. "Not by a long shot." As Hayes and his men disappeared into the gathering darkness, the tension in the air gradually dissipated. Several townspeople approached Cordelia and Nathaniel, some curious, some approving, some simply relieved that violence had been avoided. Jacob Jackson clapped Nathaniel on the shoulder. "Smart move," he commented. "Hayes talks big, but he's all show. This'll be interesting to watch." Cordelia signed the comment to Nathaniel, who offered a small, tight smile in response. Only she noticed the doubt that briefly flickered in his eyes. As they walked back toward the schoolhouse, Thomas now safely with his father, Cordelia touched Nathaniel's arm to gain his attention. "Why challenge him that way?" she signed. Nathaniel's response was deliberate, his movements carrying a weight beyond the simple signs. "Words are his weapon. They can't be mine. I needed to change the battle." Cordelia nodded slowly, understanding the strategy. "But what will you make for the auction?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips, something that speaks without sound. Later that night, after Nathaniel had returned to his forge and Cordelia to her small room behind the schoolhouse, she sat by the window, watching the stars emerge above the hills. The confrontation with Hayes had shaken her more than she wanted to admit, stirring memories of other rejections, other dismissals throughout her life. Yet something felt different this time. In Silver Bend, she had found not just refuge but purpose, not just acceptance but connection. In the quiet strength of Nathaniel's presence, in the eager hands of her students learning to speak in silence, in the growing respect of townspeople who had initially dismissed her, Cordelia recognized something she had been seeking all her life: belonging. She opened her journal and began to write, her neat script filling the page with thoughts too complex for simple signs. "I came west seeking security in a man I had never met, believing my worth lay in being what someone else needed. How strange that in rejection I found freedom. In silence, I found my voice. And in a man who has never heard me speak, I found someone who truly listens, Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, a sound like distant conversation. Cordelia closed her journal and prepared for bed, her mind already turning to tomorrow's lessons and to the quiet battle that had just begun in Silver Bend. Word of the challenge between Nathaniel Wilson and Samuel Hayes spread through Silver Bend like wildfire in dry brush. By morning, children whispered about it in the schoolyard. Miners discussed it during their shift changes, and ladies deliberated over it at the general store. The fall festival auction, typically a modest affair to raise funds for the church, roof had suddenly transformed into the most anticipated event of the season. Cordelia felt the weight of curious stares as she walked to school the following day. Some gazes held amusement, others skepticism, and a few, particularly from those who relied on Hayes's mines for their livelihood, open hostility. She kept her spine straight and her eyes forward, giving no outward sign of her inner anxiety. Rebecca was waiting at the schoolhouse door, her expression caught between concern and excitement. "Is it true?" she asked as soon as Cordelia approached. "Did Mr. Wilson really challenge Mr. Hayes to some sort of contest?" Cordelia nodded, setting down her basket of books and removing her shawl. "It's not what you might think. There won't be any fighting, just a test of skill and creativity." Rebecca released a relieved breath. "Thank goodness, though I must say you've certainly stirred things up in Silver Bend." She lowered her voice, though no one else was present. "Mrs. Quinn says Mr. Hayes was in a terrible mood this morning, ordered his breakfast sent back twice, and snapped at the serving girl." "He made his choice," Cordelia replied, arranging her teaching materials for the day. "Now he has to live with it." "And what about Mr. Wilson? What will he create for the auction?" Cordelia paused, her hands stilling over the stack of reading. "Primers. I don't know. He wants it to be a surprise, even from me." The truth was more complex. Nathaniel had thrown down the challenge in a moment of righteous defiance, but Cordelia had seen the flicker of doubt in his eyes afterward. Hayes was wealthy, with resources and connections. He could easily commission an impressive piece or import something exotic from San Francisco. Nathaniel had only his skill, his forge, and the limited materials available to him. Yet Cordelia trusted him. In the weeks since their first meeting, she had come to recognize the depth of his brilliance, how his hands could coax beauty from the most unyielding metal, how his eyes saw patterns and possibilities where others saw only raw materials. The school bell rang, summoning children from the yard. As they filed in, Cordelia noticed Thomas Jackson sporting a fresh black eye. "Thomas," she called him aside gently. "What happened?" The boy shuffled his feet, reluctant to meet her gaze. "Nothing, Miss Cordelia." "Thomas!" she pressed more firmly. He sighed. "Billy Hayes said I was stupid for learning devil signs. His pa told him anyone who talks with their hands is touched in the head." His chin lifted defiantly. "I told him he was wrong. Then he hit me, so I hit him back." Cordelia's heart sank. Billy Hayes was Samuel's 10-year-old nephew who had recently arrived to live with his uncle after his parents' death. The conflict had already spread to the children. "Fighting won't change his mind, Thomas," she said gently. "I know, but I wasn't going to let him say those things about you and Mr. Wilson." His young face was solemn. "Pa says sometimes you gotta stand up, even when it's hard." Cordelia squeezed his shoulder. "Your father is a wise man, but next time use your words, spoken or signed, before your fists. Now go take your seat." The incident troubled her throughout the morning lessons. She had never intended to become a focal point for division in Silver Bend, yet that was precisely what was happening. Hayes's resentment had transformed her quiet teaching and friendship with Nathaniel into something controversial, even threatening. During the lunch hour, while the children played outside under Rebecca's supervision, Cordelia made a decision. She wrote a quick note to Rebecca explaining her absence, then set out for Nathaniel's forge. If they were to face this challenge together, they needed a strategy. The rhythmic clanging of hammer against metal guided her to the blacksmith shop. Nathaniel was hard at work, his powerful arms glistening with sweat as he shaped a glowing piece of iron. Unlike his usual practical work, horseshoes, hinges, tools, this piece seemed more intricate, its purpose not immediately obvious. He sensed her presence before she could announce herself, turning with a questioning look that softened into welcome when he saw her. Setting down his hammer, he wiped his hands on a rag and signed, "Shouldn't you be teaching? The children are at lunch," she explained. "I needed to see you." His brows drew together in concern. "Is something wrong?" Cordelia hesitated, unsure how to explain her worries without appearing to doubt him. Instead, she asked, "What are you making for the auction?" Nathaniel's expression became guarded. He glanced at the partially formed metal on his anvil, then back. To her, signing, "Not ready to show yet. I trust you," she assured him quickly. Hayes is causing trouble. The children are fighting because of us." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. He reached for the slate that now permanently resided beside his workbench. "Hayes is afraid," he wrote. "He can't control what he doesn't understand." And, "What is it he doesn't understand?" Cordelia wrote beneath his words. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment, his blue eyes intent. Finally, he wrote that some connections don't need words. The simple statement hung between them, profound in its implication. Cordelia felt heat rise to her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from the resonant truth of it. What had grown between them transcended conventional communication. It existed in shared glances, in gentle touches, in mutual understanding that required no translation. "What can I do to help?" She signed, redirecting the conversation to safer ground. Nathaniel considered, then signed, "Teach me more signs, not just for things, for feelings." The request surprised her. Though Nathaniel had learned many practical signs from her, they had focused primarily on objects, actions, and simple concepts. The language of emotions was more complex, more nuanced, and far more personal. "Now?" she asked. He nodded, setting aside his work and giving her his full attention. For the next half hour, Cordelia taught him signs he had never requested before: joy, fear, hope, frustration, pride, longing. He learned with his customary focus, his strong hands initially awkward but quickly adapting to the subtle distinctions between similar emotions. When she showed him the sign for love, crossed arms pressed to the chest, then extending outward, his eyes never left hers as he replicated the movement with careful precision. The forge seemed suddenly warmer, the air between them charged with unspoken meaning. Cordelia looked away first, signing that she needed to return to school. "Thank you." Nathaniel signed as she prepared to leave. "I needed these words." "For what?" she couldn't help asking. He smiled mysteriously. "You'll see." The days leading up to the fall festival passed in a blur of activity. Cordelia divided her time between teaching, helping with festival preparations, and visiting Nathaniel's forge, though he now kept his special project carefully hidden whenever she arrived, working on it only when alone. Hayes, meanwhile, made a show of commissioning something from Sacramento, dispatching one of his men on the stagecoach with strict instructions. The mystery around both men's auction pieces only heightened the town's anticipation. Not everyone shared the excitement, however. As Cordelia left the general store one afternoon, the owner's wife, Mrs. Whitaker, stopped her with a concerned expression. "Miss Palmer," she said quietly, "I feel I should warn you. Mr. Hayes has been meeting with Reverend Porter quite frequently. I overheard them discussing the spiritual dangers of your hand signs." Cordelia's stomach tightened. Reverend Porter was new to Silver Bend, young and eager to establish his authority. If Hayes convinced him to denounce sign language from the pulpit, it could undo all the progress they'd made. "Thank you for telling me, Mrs. Whitaker," she replied. "Is there anything else I should know?" The older woman hesitated. "Just be careful. Hayes has influence with people who matter in this town. He's not a man who forgives easily." Cordelia nodded, her mind already racing with implications. That evening she shared the warning with Nathaniel as they sat on the bench outside his forge, watching the sunset paint the hills in copper and gold. "We should stop the challenge," she signed, after explaining Mrs. Whitaker's words. "It's causing too much division." Nathaniel shook his head firmly. "No, that's what he wants, for us to back down, to disappear." "I don't want trouble for you," Cordelia insisted. "This began with me." His expression softened, and he took her hands in his, stilling their anxious movements. For a moment he simply held them, his calloused thumbs tracing gentle circles on her palms. Then he reached for the slate. "Before you came, I was just the strange deaf man who made useful things," he wrote. "People tolerated me, but never saw me. You changed that. You gave me a voice that doesn't need sound." Cordelia's eyes stung with unexpected tears. "You gave me something." "Too," she signed when he returned the slate. "Acceptance, understanding. I've never had that before." "Then we fought together," he signed decisively. "Not with fists or shouts, with truth." She nodded, drawing strength from his certainty. Whatever Hayes was planning, they would face it as they had faced everything in Silver Bend, side by side, in eloquent silence. The fall festival arrived on a perfect autumn morning, crisp and clear, with leaves dancing like flames in the gentle breeze. The town square bustled with activity as merchants set up booths, children ran laughing between displays, and musicians tuned their instruments on a small wooden stage. At the center of it all stood the auction table, still empty but surrounded by curious onlookers hoping for an early glimpse of the competing entries. The items would remain covered until the official unveiling at noon, adding to the drama that had consumed Silver Bend for weeks. Cordelia arrived early, having promised to help Rebecca with the schoolchildren's choral performance. As she crossed the square, she noticed Reverend Porter deep in conversation with Samuel Hayes near the church steps. Both men fell silent as she passed, following her with calculated stares. She felt a flutter of apprehension, but pushed it aside, focusing instead on the children who greeted her enthusiastically. They had prepared a special song for the festival, with accompanying hand signs that Cordelia had taught them, a simple demonstration of how spoken and signed language could complement each other beautifully. "Is Mr. Wilson coming to see us sing?" "Miss Cordelia?" asked Sarah, a small girl with blonde braids. "I'm sure he'll be here," Cordelia assured her, though in truth she hadn't seen Nathaniel since the previous evening. He had been working through the night to finish his auction piece, promising to meet her at the festival when it was complete. As the morning progressed, the square filled with townspeople and visitors from neighboring settlements. Cordelia searched the crowd periodically for Nathaniel's tall figure, but saw no sign of him. The auction was scheduled to begin in less than an hour, and his absence was becoming noticeable. Rebecca approached, her face pinched with worry. "The children are ready to perform, but I don't see Mr. Wilson anywhere. And Mr. Hayes just arrived with his auction piece. It's enormous, whatever it is. It took 3 men to carry it." Cordelia's concern deepened. "I'll check his forge. Perhaps he lost track of time." "Hurry," Rebecca urged. "The children wanted him to see their signs, and the auction—" "I know," Cordelia interrupted, already turning toward the path that led to Nathaniel's workshop. She walked as quickly as dignity would allow, her skirts gathered in one hand to avoid the dust. As she approached the forge, she noticed something unusual, the absence of smoke from the chimney. Nathaniel's fire was out, something that rarely happened when he was working. The workshop door stood partially open. Cordelia called out as she entered, though she knew he wouldn't hear her. The interior was dim after the bright sunlight outside. and it took a moment for her eyes to adjust. The forge was cold, the tools neatly arranged, the floor swept clean. On the workbench sat an object covered with a simple cloth. Beside it, a folded piece of paper with her name written in Nathaniel's careful hand. Cordelia's heart raced as she unfolded the note. Cordelia, I finished my piece for the auction. Take it to the square for me. Something has happened. Hayes's men came before dawn. Don't worry, I am unharmed but must handle this before facing the town. Trust me. Nathaniel. Her hands trembled as she set down the note. What had Hayes done? And what had Nathaniel created that was worth such interference? Carefully, she lifted the cloth covering the mysterious object. What she saw beneath stole her breath. It was a book, or rather, a sculpture of a book, crafted entirely of metal. The cover was intricately worked iron, polished to a soft gleam, and inscribed with a title, Voices of Silence. But it was the pages that truly astonished her. Each one was a delicate sheet of hammered metal, impossibly thin and flexible, etched with words and corresponding hand signs. Cordelia turned the metal pages with wonder. Nathaniel had created a sign language primer, the first she had ever seen, with each page depicting a different word or concept. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Each sign rendered with lifelike precision, each word etched in flowing script beneath. On the final page, she found a personal message, painstakingly inscribed. Some speak with voices, some with hands, some with the work of their hearts. All are worthy of being heard. Below these words, a single sign was etched more deeply than the rest, the sign for love. Tears welled in Cordelia's eyes as she realized what Nathaniel had done. This wasn't merely an item for auction. It was a declaration, to her, to Hayes, to all of Silver Bend, of the value in their unique form of communication. It was also, unmistakably, a declaration of his feelings. She carefully covered the book again and lifted it from the workbench. Though made of metal, it was surprisingly light, a testament to Nathaniel's skill. Whatever Hayes had planned, whatever had drawn Nathaniel away, Cordelia knew she had to ensure this creation reached its intended audience. As she hurried back toward town, the metal book cradled in her arms, she sent up a silent prayer that Nathaniel would join her soon. The battle for Silver Bend's heart was about to begin, and she needed him beside her for what was to come. The festival was in full swing when Cordelia returned to the town square. Children darted between stalls with sticky candy, musicians played a lively fiddle tune, and the auction items were being arranged on the display table. All except Hayes's mysterious contribution, which remained in a large crate nearby, guarded by two of his miners. Rebecca rushed to Cordelia's side, relief washing over her face. There you are. The auction begins in 20 minutes. Did you find Mr. Wilson? No, Cordelia replied, her voice steady despite her concern. But I have his piece for the auction. She nodded toward the wrapped metal book in her arms. Rebecca eyed it curiously but asked the more pressing question, where is he? I don't know exactly. He left a note saying there was trouble, something about Hayes's men coming to the forge before dawn. Cordelia glanced toward the auction table. What is Hayes offering? No one knows yet. It arrived in that crate, and he won't let anyone near it until the unveiling. Rebecca lowered her voice. He seems awfully confident, Cordelia. Been strutting around all morning like he's already won. Cordelia's jaw tightened. Is Reverend Porter here? At the church booth with his wife. Why? Mrs. Whitaker warned me that Hayes has been trying to turn him against sign language, against us. I'm worried about what might happen today. Rebecca squeezed her arm reassuringly. Half the town has seen how the children have flourished under your teaching. Whatever Hayes is planning, he can't undo that. Cordelia wasn't so sure, but she nodded and moved toward the auction table to register Nathaniel's entry. The auction, Master Mr. Finch greeted her with raised eyebrows. "Miss Palmer, I was beginning to wonder if Mr. Wilson had lost his nerve." "He sends his apologies for not delivering this personally," Cordelia replied, placing the wrapped book on the table. "He was unexpectedly detained." Finch made a notation in his ledger. "Very well. The auction begins promptly at noon. All items will be unveiled simultaneously." He glanced at her with genuine curiosity. "I must admit, the town is rather eager to see what Mr. Wilson has created to challenge Mr. Hayes." "It will speak for itself," Cordelia assured him. As she turned to leave, she nearly collided with Samuel Hayes himself. He was impeccably dressed in an expensive suit, his beard freshly trimmed, his demeanor one of barely contained satisfaction. "Miss Palmer," he greeted her with false courtesy. "I see you're delivering Wilson's entry. How devoted of you. Is he indisposed?" The deliberate emphasis on the word made Cordelia's skin prickle with apprehension. Hayes knew something about Nathaniel's absence, perhaps had orchestrated it. "He'll be here shortly," she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. Hayes smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "I wouldn't count on that. Some men simply aren't cut out for public spectacles." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You backed the wrong horse, Miss Palmer. I offered you respectability, a position in society. Instead, you chose a broken man who can't even hear his own hammer." Anger flashed through Cordelia, hot and unfamiliar. "Mr. Wilson hears more with his eyes than you do with your ears, Mr. Hayes, and he speaks more truth with his hands than you do with all your fine words." Hayes's jaw tightened, the only indication that her barb had struck home. "We'll see what Silverbend thinks about that," he replied, then strode away toward his waiting auction piece. Cordelia watched him go, fighting to calm her racing heart. Something was very wrong. Hayes was too confident, too pleased with himself. And where was Nathaniel? "Not yet," Cordelia admitted, "but we'll perform beautifully for everyone who is here. Remember what we practiced." As the children took their places, Cordelia noticed Reverend Porter watching from the front of the crowd, his expression stern and assessing. Beside him stood his wife, a gentle-faced woman who had always been kind to Cordelia at church services. The musicians concluded their piece, and Rebecca stepped forward to introduce the children's performance. "Ladies and gentlemen, the students of Silverbend School have prepared a special presentation combining songs and the hand signs they've been learning from Miss Palmer." A murmur ran through the audience, some appreciative, some skeptical. Cordelia positioned herself where the children could see her hands clearly, then gave the signal to begin. The children's voices rose in sweet harmony, singing a simple hymn about friendship and kindness. As they sang, their small hands formed the corresponding signs, creating a visual melody that matched their vocal one. The effect was mesmerizing, sound and silence working in perfect tandem, enhancing rather than competing with each other. Cordelia watched the crowd's reaction from the corner of her eye. Many parents beamed with pride at their children's performance. Others looked intrigued by this novel form of expression. Even Reverend Porter's stern countenance had softened slightly as he observed the innocent joy on the children's faces. When the song concluded, spontaneous applause erupted from the audience. The children bowed, grinning with pride at their success. Thomas caught Cordelia's eye and signed quickly. "We did it," she nodded, returning the sign with a smile. "Beautiful." As the children dispersed to find their parents, Mr. Finch mounted the stage to announce the beginning of the auction. Cordelia made her way through the crowd toward the display table, still scanning for any sign of Nathaniel. "Ladies and gentlemen," Finch called, his auctioneer's voice carrying across the square, "we now begin the highlight of our fall festival, the charity auction to benefit our church roof fund." The crowd pressed forward eagerly, many whispering about the much-anticipated showdown between Hayes and Wilson. Cordelia found herself standing near Jacob Jackson, who greeted her with a concerned frown. "Any word from Wilson?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "Something's wrong, Mr. Jackson. Hayes is too pleased with himself." Jackson's frown deepened. "I don't like it either. My crew saw some of Hayes's men heading out of town before dawn, toward Wilson's place. I sent Thomas to find you, but you'd already left the schoolhouse." Cordelia's concern escalated to genuine fear. What had Hayes done? "And now," Finch announced, "the moment you've all been waiting for. 2 special entries have been submitted to our auction this year, in what some have called a contest of skill and vision." He gestured to the 2 covered items on the display table, Nathaniel's book at one end, Hayes's mysterious crate at the other. First, from Mr. Samuel Hayes, mine owner and prominent citizen of Silver Bend. At Finch's signal, Hayes stepped forward and unveiled his contribution with a flourish. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. It was a magnificent music box imported from Europe, its polished mahogany case inlaid with mother-of-pearl and gold. Hayes turned a key at its base, and a beautiful melody filled the air as tiny mechanical figures, a lady and gentleman, danced across the top. "This music box," Hayes announced proudly, "was crafted by the finest artisans in Vienna. It represents the beauty of cultured society, the harmony of civilization, the very values upon which Silver Bend was built." He paused dramatically. "It speaks to us all in the universal language of music, a language anyone with ears can appreciate." The pointed barb was not lost on the crowd. Several people shifted uncomfortably, while others nodded in appreciation of the beautiful object. "And now," Finch continued, "the entry from Mr. Nathaniel Wilson." All eyes turned to the other end of the table, where Cordelia's heart sank as she realized she would have to unveil Nathaniel's creation in his absence. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. "Mr. Wilson was unavoidably detained," she explained, her quiet voice nonetheless carrying in the sudden hush. "He asked me to present his piece." With steady hands, she removed the cloth covering the metal book. Another gasp, softer but no less genuine, rippled through the crowd as the sunlight caught the polished surface, sending gleams of light dancing across upturned faces. "This is Voices of Silence," Cordelia said, opening the book, to display its intricate pages. "A primer of hand signs created entirely of metal by Mr. Wilson." She turned the pages slowly, allowing everyone to see the beautifully rendered signs etched into each metal leaf. "Mr. Wilson believes that communication transcends sound, that understanding can be forged through many means. This book represents a bridge between worlds that often remain separate." Hayes snorted loudly. "A book that no one can read, made by a man who cannot hear. How fitting." He turned to address the crowd directly. "My friends, I ask you, which offering truly represents the future we want for Silver Bend? Beautiful music that lifts the spirit, or silent gestures that separate rather than unite?" A tense silence fell over the gathering. Cordelia felt their scrutiny, their uncertainty. Without Nathaniel beside her, his absence conspicuous and damning, she feared Hayes's expensive import would win by default. Then, unexpectedly, Sarah, the little girl with blonde braids, broke from her parents' side and approached the table. She stood on tiptoe to see the metal book, her small finger tracing one of the etched signs. "This is friend," she announced clearly, making the corresponding gesture with her free hand, "and this one is love." She demonstrated again, crossing her arms over her chest and then extending them outward. Thomas Jackson joined her, then another child and another, each recognizing and demonstrating signs they had learned in school. Their parents watched in amazement as the children effortlessly translated the metal pages, bringing Nathaniel's creation to life through their movements. "It's not just a book," Thomas explained to the stunned adults. It's like a key. So, people who can't hear can still talk to us, and we can talk to them. Mrs. Porter, the Reverend's wife, stepped forward hesitantly. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to the book. Cordelia nodded, opening to a page showing the sign for welcome. The Reverend's wife studied it, then carefully replicated the gesture, her movements awkward but sincere. "Is this correct?" she asked Thomas. The boy nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, ma'am. That's perfect." Reverend Porter watched his wife with an unreadable expression, then slowly approached the table himself. He examined both entries side by side, Hayes's music box still playing its delicate melody, Nathaniel's book open to reveal its silent communication. "The music is beautiful," he said finally, "but it will eventually wind down and fall silent." He turned a page in Nathaniel's book. "This, however, gives voice to those who have none. It seems to me that both have value, though perhaps not equal worth." Hayes's face darkened with anger. "This is absurd. You can't seriously be considering—" "Where is Mr. Wilson?" Reverend Porter interrupted, looking directly at Cordelia. "Why isn't he here to speak for his own work?" Before she could answer, a commotion arose at the edge of the crowd. People turned, then parted to create a path through their midst. Cordelia's heart leapt as Nathaniel appeared, walking steadily toward the auction table. He was disheveled, his clothes dusty and torn at one shoulder, a dark bruise blooming on his jaw. Behind him came Sheriff Taylor, leading two of Hayes's miners with their hands bound. The music box's melody seemed suddenly discordant in the tense silence that fell over the square. "What is the meaning of this?" Finch demanded as the sheriff approached. "These men have some explaining to do," Sheriff Taylor replied grimly. "Seems they decided to make sure Mr. Wilson missed his own auction by locking him in the old mine shaft out past his property." All eyes turned to Hayes, whose face had gone pale beneath his well-trimmed beard. "I had nothing to do with that," he blustered, though his darting gaze betrayed him. "They say differently," the sheriff countered. "Claim you paid them to keep. Wilson occupied until after the auction. Said you didn't specify how, just that he couldn't show his face in town today." A low murmur of disapproval rippled through the crowd. Hayes's desperate glance found no allies among the gathered townspeople, only shock and growing condemnation. Nathaniel moved to stand beside Cordelia, his presence steady despite his disheveled appearance. She wanted to reach for his hand, to ask if he was truly unharmed, but propriety held her back. Instead, she signed discreetly, "Are you all right?" He nodded slightly, then turned his attention to his creation on the display table. His expression softened as he saw it open, surrounded by children eager to demonstrate their knowledge of the signs depicted within. Hayes, sensing the tide turning against him, made one last desperate attempt to salvage his position. "This changes." "Nothing. The auction is about the items themselves, not the men who presented them." "I disagree," Reverend Porter said, his voice carrying authority. "These items represent not just craftsmanship, but values. Mr. Hayes offers us imported beauty that depends on mechanics to create harmony. Mr. Wilson offers us a tool for human connection that depends on understanding and inclusion." He looked around at the gathered townspeople. "I know which better represents the spirit of Silver Bend as I wish to see it." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Jacob Jackson stepped forward and placed a hand on Nathaniel's shoulder. "I'll start the bidding on Wilson's book at $20, he announced firmly. "25, called Mrs. Porter, to her husband's evident surprise. 30, added Rebecca Holloway. Within minutes, a bidding war had erupted over Nathaniel's creation, driving its price far beyond what anyone had expected. Hayes's music box, for all its imported elegance, drew only a single courtesy bid from the hotel proprietress. When the gavel finally fell, voices of silence had sold for an unprecedented sum to a consortium of Silver Bend parents, who immediately donated it to the school so that all children might learn its lessons. As the crowd dispersed and the auction continued with its more ordinary offerings, Cordelia and Nathaniel found themselves momentarily alone beside the display table. Hayes had vanished, his humiliation complete, his music box left behind. "You came," Cordelia signed, her hands trembling slightly with relief. "I promised I would," Nathaniel responded. Then, with careful precision, he signed the new words she had taught him. "I was afraid. Then I was angry. Now I am—" He hesitated, searching for the right sign, then formed the one for joy with deliberate care. Cordelia's eyes filled with tears as she recognized not just the sign, but the depth of feeling behind it. Without caring who might see, she reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. In that moment, in the middle of Silver Bend's bustling fall festival, words, spoken or signed, seemed entirely unnecessary. Some truths needed no translation at all. The aftermath of the fall festival rippled through Silver Bend like stones cast in still water. Samuel Hayes retreated to his manor on the hill, his public humiliation compounded by the sheriff's investigation. Into his minor's actions. Though he maintained his innocence, few believed him. The music box he had imported at such expense sat unclaimed in Mr. Finch's auction house, a gleaming reminder of the day's events. For Cordelia and Nathaniel, life shifted in subtle but significant ways. No longer were they merely tolerated oddities on the fringes of town life. They had become, almost overnight, symbols of something many in Silver Bend hadn't realized they valued. Authenticity over pretense, connection over convention. The first snow of winter dusted the hills around Silver Bend 3 weeks after the festival, transforming the town into a tableau of white-capped buildings and smoke curling from chimneys into the pearl-grey sky. The schoolhouse stove burned cheerfully. As Cordelia conducted her morning lessons, the children's breath visible in the chilly air despite the fire's efforts. "Miss Cordelia," Thomas Jackson called during arithmetic, "someone's coming." The class turned as one toward the windows, where a figure on horseback approached through the gently falling snow. Even at a distance, Cordelia recognized the broad-shouldered silhouette of Nathaniel Wilson. "Continue with your problems," she instructed, moving to the door to greet him. Nathaniel dismounted as she stepped onto the porch, his horse's breath steaming in the cold air. He wore a heavy coat, and his dark beard was flecked with snowflakes. In his gloved hands, he carried a wooden box. "Good morning," he signed, his eyes crinkling with a smile that warmed Cordelia despite the chill. "This is a surprise," she responded, her own smile reflecting his. "Is everything all right?" He nodded, then held up the box. "I made something for the school. May I show the children?" Curiosity piqued, Cordelia led him into the classroom, where excited whispers erupted at his entrance. Since the festival, Nathaniel had attained near-heroic status among the students, particularly the boys, who regarded his escape from the mine shaft as the height of adventure. "Mr. Wilson has brought something to show us," Cordelia announced, then signed the same for Nathaniel's benefit. Thomas, who had appointed himself Nathaniel's unofficial interpreter whenever signs grew complex, bounced eagerly in his seat. "What is it, Mr. Wilson? Another metal book?" Nathaniel shook his head, setting the wooden box on Cordelia's desk. With deliberate care, he opened it to reveal a set of small wooden blocks, each face carved with a different letter, both standard English, and the corresponding hand sign. "Alphabet blocks," Sarah exclaimed, rising from her seat for a better view. "Not just any alphabet," Cordelia realized, examining the blocks more closely. "These show both written letters and their sign language equivalents." Nathaniel nodded, his expression a mixture of pride and shyness as the children gathered around the desk, exclaiming over his handiwork. Each block featured meticulously carved signs alongside traditional letters, the workmanship extraordinary in its detail. "Did you make these yourself, Mr. Wilson?" Rebecca asked from where she supervised the older students. He nodded, then signed, slowly so the children could follow. "For learning, for everyone." Thomas translated unnecessarily, his chest puffed with importance. "He made them so everyone can learn both ways to talk." The joy on the children's faces as they examined the blocks brought a lump to Cordelia's throat. She caught Nathaniel's eye over their heads, signing quickly. "Thank you. This is wonderful." His answering smile conveyed everything words could not. After showing the children how to use the blocks to spell out simple words in both written form and sign, Nathaniel took his leave, refusing Cordelia's invitation to stay for lunch with a regretful shake of his head. He had commissions to complete. His business had grown significantly since the festival, with orders now coming from neighboring towns as word of his skill spread. As she watched him ride away through the steadily falling snow, Cordelia felt a now familiar warmth suffuse her chest. What had begun as a practical alliance between two outsiders had grown into something deeper, more profound. They had not spoken of it directly, neither with signs nor written words, but it existed in the spaces between their communications, in shared glances and brief touches that lingered longer each time. That evening, as Cordelia prepared for bed in her small room behind the schoolhouse, a knock sounded at her door. Wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, she opened it to find Rebecca standing on the threshold, snow dusting her bonnet and a troubled expression on her face. "I'm sorry to disturb you so late," Rebecca said, stepping inside at Cordelia's invitation, "but I've just come from a meeting at the church, and I thought you should know." "Know what?" Cordelia asked, stoking the small stove to warm her unexpected visitor. Rebecca unwound her scarf with nervous fingers. "Samuel Hayes has petitioned the school board to prohibit the teaching of sign language at the school. He claims it's unnecessarily confusing to the children and diverts attention from proper English." Cordelia stilled, her hand tightening on the poker. "Does he now?" "There's more," Rebecca continued. "He's offered a substantial donation to the school building fund, enough for a new roof and an additional classroom, contingent on accepting his condition." "And how did the board respond?" Cordelia kept her voice steady, though her heart raced. "They're considering it." Rebecca's expression was apologetic. "Money speaks loudly in Silver Bend, especially with winter setting in and the school in need of repairs." Cordelia set down the poker carefully, buying time to master her emotions. "I see. I argued against it," Rebecca hastened to add. "So did Jacob Jackson and several other parents. We reminded them how the children have thrived with this new form of expression, how it's built bridges in our community." She sighed. But Hayes was prepared. He brought along Mrs. Ellison from Sacramento, a proper teacher with credentials from an Eastern college. Suggested she could replace... She trailed off, unable to complete the sentence. "Me," Cordelia finished for her. "He suggested Mrs. Ellison could replace me." Rebecca nodded unhappily. "The board will vote tomorrow evening. I wanted you to have time to prepare." After Rebecca left, Cordelia sat by her window, watching snowflakes swirl in the amber glow of the street lamps. Hayes's move was calculated, a subtle revenge disguised as generosity. The board might resist his influence if only money were involved, but the combination of financial incentive and a credentialed teacher would be difficult. To refuse, the thought of leaving Silver Bend sent a pang through Cordelia's chest. This place, which had initially rejected her, had become home in ways she had never anticipated. Her students, her friendship with Rebecca, her deepening bond with Nathaniel, all hung in the balance because one man couldn't accept defeat gracefully. Sleep eluded her that night, her mind churning with scenarios and potential arguments for the board meeting. By morning, she had reached a decision. She would not fight Hayes on his terms, with loud arguments and political maneuvering. She would face this challenge as she had faced every other in her life, with quiet determination and the truth of her actions. The school day passed in a blur of lessons and concerned glances from Rebecca. Cordelia maintained her usual calm demeanor, though several children noticed her distraction during afternoon recitation. "Are you sad, Miss Cordelia?" Sarah asked during dismissal, her small face pinched with worry. Cordelia knelt to the child's level, signing as she spoke. "Not sad, just thinking very hard about something important." "Is it a grown-up problem?" Thomas interjected, having appointed himself part of all interesting conversations. "Pa says grown-ups always have problems they don't tell kids about." Despite her worries, Cordelia smiled. "Your father is a wise man, Thomas. Now go home before the snow gets worse." As twilight fell, bringing with it another flurry of snowflakes, Cordelia wrapped herself in her warmest shawl and set out for Nathaniel's forge. The path was already covered in fresh powder, her footprints the only disruption in the pristine white blanket. Smoke from Nathaniel's chimney rose in a steady column against the darkening sky, guiding her forward. The heat of the forge enveloped her as she entered, bringing feeling back to her numbed fingers and nose. Nathaniel looked up from his work. Surprise followed swiftly by pleasure crossing his face as he recognized her. "I didn't expect you in this weather," he signed, setting down his hammer. "I needed to see you," she replied, brushing snow from her shawl. "Something has happened." His expression grew serious as she explained Hayes's latest scheme and its potential consequences. By the time she finished, Nathaniel was pacing before the forge, his movements sharp with anger. "He won't stop," he signed, forcefully. "Not until he drives us both from Silver Bend." "Perhaps he's right," Cordelia signed, her movements deliberately provocative. "Perhaps I should leave. Find somewhere new, where my methods won't cause such controversy." Nathaniel stopped pacing abruptly, staring at her with disbelief. "You would give up? Let him win. Is it giving up to recognize when a battle can't be won?" Her hands formed the signs precisely, challenging him. "Silver Bend existed before us, and will continue without us." For a moment he looked stricken, as if she had physically struck him. Then understanding dawned in his eyes. He approached her slowly, his work-roughened hands taking hers gently. "You're testing me?" he signed, his mouth quivering into a half-smile. "Seeing if I'll encourage you to run." She nodded, relief washing through her that he had seen through her pretense so easily. And I think," he signed deliberately, "that we should attend this board meeting together." The school board convened the following evening in the church hall, its 5 members seated at a table facing rows of benches filled with concerned parents and citizens. Samuel Hayes occupied a prominent position in the front row, flanked by Mrs. Ellison, a severe-looking woman in an expensive traveling costume, and his lawyer from Sacramento. Cordelia and Nathaniel entered together, drawing all eyes as they made their way to seats near the back. They had agreed on a strategy during the previous evening's conversation. They would observe first, understand the board's inclinations, then act accordingly. The meeting began with formal introductions and an explanation of the proposal before them. Hayes rose to speak, his voice carrying confidently through the crowded hall. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board, esteemed citizens of Silver Bend, I come before you today not as a critic, but as a benefactor. Our growing town deserves an educational facility equal to its promise, a school that will prepare our children for success in the wider world." He gestured toward Mrs. Ellison. "I have engaged, at personal expense, a qualified educator from Sacramento to assess our current curriculum. Her findings suggest that while our school has certain charms, it lacks the rigor and focus required for a modern education. Mrs. Ellison nodded primly on cue. Hayes continued, his voice taking on a concerned tone that Cordelia recognized as entirely artificial. Of particular concern is the recent inclusion of so-called sign language in our children's instruction. While potentially interesting as a curiosity, this practice diverts valuable time from essential subjects and may actually impede proper linguistic development. A murmur ran through the assembled parents, some nodding agreement, others frowning in disagreement. Hayes pressed, on undeterred. My offer is simple. A generous donation to fund immediate school repairs and expansion, coupled with the engagement of Mrs. Ellison as a consultant to update our curriculum to the highest standards. In return, I ask only that we refocus our educational priorities on proven methods that will serve our children well in the future. The board chairman, Mr. Peterson, stroked his beard thoughtfully. Your concerns are noted, Mr. Hayes, and your generosity is commendable. However, we should also hear from those with differing perspectives. He glanced around the room. Would anyone else care to address the board on this matter? Jacob Jackson stood immediately. I would, sir. As a parent and a taxpayer. For the next half hour, various citizens presented their views, some supporting Hayes's proposal, others defending the current teaching methods. Through it all, Cordelia sat quietly beside Nathaniel, observing the board members' reactions. 3 seemed swayed by Hayes's arguments, while 2 appeared more sympathetic to the parents' defense of sign language. Finally, Mr. Peterson's gaze found Cordelia in the back row. Miss Palmer, as the teacher most directly involved in this matter, would you care to offer your thoughts? All heads turned toward her as she rose, straightening her simple grey dress before moving to the front of the room. Nathaniel followed. Standing slightly behind her in silent support, Cordelia looked out at the assembled faces, curious, judgmental, supportive, hostile, and took a deep breath. This was the moment that would determine not just her future, but the future of what she and Nathaniel had built in Silver Bend. The room fell silent, waiting for her defense. And Cordelia Palmer, the woman who had been rejected for being too quiet, prepared to make the most important speech of her life. The church hall fell silent as Cordelia stood before the school board, lamplight casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Outside, snow continued to fall, muffling the world in a blanket of white that seemed to hold Silver Bend in suspension, waiting for her words. She did not speak immediately. Instead, she turned to Nathaniel and signed a brief request. He nodded and stepped forward to stand beside her, his steady presence bolstering her resolve. Distinguished members of the board, neighbors, friends, Cordelia began, her voice soft but clear in the hushed room. I came to Silver Bend nearly 6 months ago as a mail-order bride, rejected before I could truly begin, because I was deemed too quiet for this lively town. She paused, allowing her gaze to find Samuel Hayes among the crowd. He shifted uncomfortably. Under her direct look, Mr. Hayes believed that my quietness was a flaw, that a woman of value must command attention with her voice. I understand his position. In a town built on silver strikes and bold claims, silence can seem like weakness. Cordelia turned slightly toward Nathaniel. But then I met Mr. Wilson, a man who has lived in silence not by choice but by circumstance, a man whose hands create beauty from unyielding metal, whose eyes hear what others miss, whose heart understands the value of communication beyond sound. She faced the board again, her voice growing stronger. From Mr. Wilson, I learned that quietness is not emptiness. From the children of Silver Bend, I learned that curiosity transcends all barriers. And from all of you, in your acceptance, your questions, your challenge, and yes, even your resistance, I learned that a community grows not through uniformity, but through understanding. Mrs. Ellison sniffed audibly, but Cordelia continued. Undeterred, Mr. Hayes has suggested that teaching sign language diverts our children from proper education. I respectfully disagree. In the month since we introduced signing to the classroom, reading comprehension has improved by nearly 30%. Disciplinary problems have decreased significantly. Children who once struggled to sit still now engage actively with learning. She gestured to a stack of papers on the board's table, the quarterly assessments she had compiled meticulously. The evidence is in your hands. These are not simply my observations, but measurable results. Mr. Peterson shuffled through the papers, his brow furrowed in concentration. These figures are certainly impressive, Miss Palmer, but Mrs. Ellison suggests that such improvements might be temporary, novelty effects that will diminish over time. That is a fair concern, Cordelia acknowledged, which is why I'm not asking you to judge solely on numbers. She turned to Nathaniel, who nodded and moved toward the door at the back of the hall. I would ask you to judge by the voices of those who matter most, the children themselves. At Nathaniel's signal, the door opened to reveal Thomas Jackson, Sarah Miller, and 4 other students from Cordelia's class, their cheeks flushed from the cold outside. They filed in solemnly, standing in a line before the board. These children have prepared something to show you, Cordelia explained, stepping back. Without a word, Thomas stepped forward. My name is Thomas Jackson, he announced clearly, signing. Simultaneously, before Miss Cordelia taught us how to sing, I got in trouble every day for talking too much. Now I talk with my hands too, and I can help others who can't say what they need. He stepped back, and Sarah took his place. My name is Sarah Miller, she said, her voice barely audible in the large room. Like Thomas, her hands formed signs as she spoke. I was afraid to speak in class because my voice is quiet. Now I can sign when words are hard and everyone still understands me. One by one, each child presented their experience. A boy who had struggled with reading until signing gave him another way to connect letters to meaning. A girl whose baby brother was born deaf and could now communicate with his family. Another who had discovered a talent for teaching others through the patient work of sign instruction. When they finished, the hall remained silent for a long moment. Then Jacob Jackson stood. My son used to come home from school frustrated and angry, he said, his voice gruff with emotion. Now he comes home proud. That's worth more than any fancy curriculum. Mrs. Porter, the Reverend's wife, rose next. I've seen these children at church, signing their hymns alongside their singing. It adds beauty to our worship, not distraction. More. Parents stood to voice support, their testimonials simple but powerful. As they spoke, Cordelia noticed a subtle change in the board members' expressions, skepticism yielding to consideration, rigidity to thoughtfulness. When the voices quieted, Cordelia stepped forward once more. I understand Mr. Hayes's desire for the best education possible for Silver Bend's children. I share that desire completely, but I believe best doesn't mean like everywhere else. It means recognizing and nurturing the unique strengths of our community. She turned to face Hayes directly. You once told me Silver Bend would eat me alive because I was too quiet. You were wrong. Silver Bend taught me to find my voice, not by becoming louder, but by discovering new ways to speak. Hayes's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, his earlier confidence notably diminished. Cordelia addressed the board one final time. I'm not asking you to reject Mr. Hayes's generous offer of financial support. Our school needs repairs, and the children deserve an expanded facility. I'm asking you to separate that gift from the conditions attached to it. Judge our teaching methods by their results, not by their conformity to convention. With that, she took Nathaniel's hand and stepped back, signaling the end of her presentation. The chairman cleared his throat, visibly moved, despite his attempt at official detachment. Thank you, Miss Palmer, and thank you, children. The board will now deliberate in private. We'll announce our decision shortly." As the board members filed into the adjacent room, the hall erupted in whispered conversations. Hayes conferred urgently with his lawyer, while Mrs. Ellison sat stiffly, her disapproval evident in every line of her posture. Nathaniel guided Cordelia to a bench at the side of the room, his hand warm against her back. When they were seated, he signed slowly. "You were magnificent." "I was terrified," she admitted, her hands trembling slightly now that the moment had passed. "Courage isn't the absence of fear," he responded. "It's acting despite it." His fingers brushed hers briefly, a touch that conveyed more than any signed or spoken word could express. In that moment, despite the uncertainty hanging over them, Cordelia felt a profound sense of peace. Whatever the board decided, she had spoken her truth, not loudly but clearly, not with volume, but with conviction. The door to the deliberation room opened sooner than expected. The board members filed back to their seats, their expressions unreadable as they arranged their papers. Mr. Peterson, as chairman, stood to address the waiting crowd. "This board has been entrusted with the education and welfare of Silver Bend's children, a responsibility we do not take lightly. We have considered Mr. Hayes's proposal carefully, along with Miss Palmer's response and the community's input." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "Silver Bend has always prided itself on independence, on finding our own way forward rather than simply following established paths. It is in that spirit that we've reached our decision." The room held its collective breath. Cordelia felt Nathaniel's hand close around hers. "We gratefully accept Mr. Hayes's financial contribution to improve our school facilities," Peterson announced. "However, we decline the condition to remove sign language instruction from our curriculum or to replace our current teaching staff." A cheer erupted from the parents and children, quickly hushed as Peterson raised his hand for silence. "Furthermore, we propose establishing Silver Bend School as a place where traditional education and innovative approaches like sign language instruction can coexist and complement each other. To that end, we invite Mrs. Ellison to consider a position not as a replacement but as an addition to our faculty, bringing her expertise to enhance our existing program." Mrs. Ellison blinked in surprise, clearly unprepared for this compromise. Hayes rose abruptly, his face flushed with anger, or embarrassment, perhaps both. "If you reject my conditions, you reject my donation," he stated flatly. Peterson nodded solemnly. "That is your right, Mr. Hayes. However, several board members have pledged personal contributions to begin our renovation fund, and Jacob Jackson has offered timber from his property for the new classroom. Silver Bend has never relied on any single individual for its prosperity. We won't start now." Hayes stood frozen for a moment, caught between pride and pragmatism. Then, unexpectedly, Mrs. Ellison rose beside him. "Mr. Hayes, if I may," she said, crisply. "I came to evaluate a teaching method I assumed was frivolous. What I've witnessed tonight suggests my assumption was incorrect." She turned to address the board directly. "I would be interested in learning more about this dual approach to education. Perhaps we might discuss terms for a consulting role rather than a replacement position." The tension in the room shifted perceptibly. Hayes, finding himself suddenly isolated in his opposition, struggled visibly with his response. Finally, with a stiff nod, he resumed his seat. "My offer stands," he said tightly. "Use the money as you see fit." A collective sigh of relief rippled through the hall. As the meeting formally concluded and people began to disperse, Cordelia found herself surrounded by well-wishers and congratulations. Through it all, Nathaniel remained at her side, a steady presence in the swirl of excitement. As they finally stepped out into the snowy night, Silver Bend lay transformed before them, not just by the blanket of white that softened its rugged edges, but by the knowledge that this place, which had once seemed so hostile to silence, had found value in quieter ways of being. They walked slowly toward the schoolhouse, their footprints leaving parallel tracks in the fresh snow. Neither spoke nor signed, content in the companionable silence they had come to cherish. At Cordelia's door they paused. Snowflakes danced in the lamplight, settling on Nathaniel's broad shoulders and in Cordelia's hair like tiny stars. "What happens now?" Nathaniel signed, his expression serious beneath its usual calm. Cordelia considered the question, understanding its layers of meaning. "Now we build," she signed back. "Not just the school, everything." His eyes searched hers, seeking confirmation of what remained unspoken between them. Together, he signed simply. In answer, Cordelia stepped closer and placed her hand gently against his cheek, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath her cold fingers. Then, with deliberate care, she formed the sign for love that she had taught him months before, arms crossed over her heart, then extending outward toward him. Nathaniel's breath caught visibly in the frigid air. His hands, always so sure when working metal, trembled slightly as he returned the sign, adding another she recognized immediately. Forever. No words were needed as he gathered her into his arms, the language of their embrace more eloquent than any speech could be. Spring came late to Silver Bend that year, but when it arrived, it brought transformations beyond the mere changing of seasons. The schoolhouse sported a new roof, gleaming with fresh shingles, and an additional classroom extended from its eastern side, built with timber from the Jackson property and labor donated by miners and merchants alike. Inside those expanded walls, something unique in the Western Territories had taken shape. A school where children learned reading and arithmetic alongside sign language, where two teaching methods complement rather than compete with each other, and where difference was celebrated as an advantage rather than tolerated as a burden. Samuel Hayes had eventually reconciled himself to the board's decision, and if he never fully embraced the innovative approach to education, he at least refrained from further opposition. His music box, finally purchased by Mrs. Porter at a reduced price, played in the church parlor during Sunday socials, its delicate melody harmonizing with the animated conversations, both spoken and signed, that filled the room. On a particularly fine May afternoon, as wildflowers painted the hills around Silver Bend in a riot of color, the town gathered once more, this time to witness a wedding unlike any they had seen before. Cordelia Palmer stood beneath an arch of twisted willow branches before Reverend Porter, wearing a simple dress of pale blue silk, her honey-brown hair adorned with tiny white blossoms. Beside her stood Nathaniel Wilson, his usually work-rough hands clean and steady as they signed his vows in the profound silence that had once divided them, but now united them. For each promise he signed, she spoke aloud, her voice clear and confident. For each promise she voiced, his hands shaped the corresponding signs, creating a ceremony that existed in both worlds at once. When Reverend Porter pronounced them husband and wife, the children from the school released a flock of paper birds into the air, each one inscribed with words of blessing in both English and sign language symbols, bridging worlds just as Cordelia and Nathaniel had done. Later, as they danced beneath lanterns strung across the town square, Nathaniel following the vibrations of the music through the wooden platform beneath his feet, Thomas Jackson approached. With his father. "Pa says to tell you we're leaving Silver Bend," the boy announced, his hands automatically forming signs alongside his words, a habit now so ingrained he did it without thinking. Leaving. Cordelia's heart sank at the thought of losing her first and most enthusiastic pupil. "But why?" Jacob Jackson smiled reassuringly. "Not for good, Mrs. Wilson. I've been asked to help establish a school in Pinecrest that follows your teaching methods. Seems word has spread about what you've accomplished here. They want Thomas to help teach the children signs, he added proudly. My boy's become something of an expert, thanks to you both. As they watched Thomas demonstrate a new sign he'd created to a circle of attentive young friends, Nathaniel squeezed Cordelia's hand. She turned to find him watching her with an expression of such profound happiness that it nearly took her breath away. Did you ever imagine this? He signed, gesturing to the celebration around them, to the easy mingling of spoken and signed conversations, to the community that had embraced what once made them outsiders. Cordelia shook her head. Never, she admitted. When I stepped off that stagecoach, all I wanted was somewhere to belong, and now, she smiled, her hands forming the response with practiced grace. Now I know that belonging isn't about finding a place that accepts you as you are. It's about creating a place where everyone can be accepted for who they are. Nathaniel nodded, understanding perfectly, as he always did. Taking her hand, he led her away from the crowd, up the gentle slope, to a viewpoint overlooking Silver Bend. In the golden light of late afternoon, the town glowed like a jewel, set in the rugged landscape. No longer a place that valued only noise and spectacle, but one that had learned the worth of quieter ways of being. It's beautiful, Cordelia signed. Leaning into the solid warmth of her husband's embrace, Nathaniel's arms tightened around her as he rested his chin on her head, his response a whisper she felt rather than heard against her hair. Yes, it is. And in that moment, as the sun painted, Silver Bend in hues of gold and promise, Cordelia Wilson, once rejected for being too quiet, found perfect eloquence in the silence they shared. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.